Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This evening, the topic of my discussion will be Africa, imperialism, and the global class struggle. A major challenge of the last century has been the reconstruction of African history and the role of the continent in the development of world civilizations. Now, particularly the economic and social systems that have dominated the planet over the last 500 years. Most researchers and writers on African affairs, both bourgeois as well as historical materialists, have recognized the African origins of human society. The contributions of successive African civilizations and cultures have been well documented in various publications. These efforts to recorrect the distortions in the way African history has been narrated and interpreted are important to understanding the significance and character of political events that are occurring on the African continent today. In order for Africa to overcome the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade, colonialism, and neo-colonialism, there must be a struggle to transform the exploitative and oppressive conditions which have been imposed by world imperialism, with the leading role being played by the ruling class here in the United States. This African struggle is taking place with greater intensity in the first decade of the 21st century. What is taking place on the continent is a direct result of the continuing efforts by the imperialist countries to dominate the resources, the labor, and the political institutions in all of the African states on the continent. Progressive and revolutionary thinkers and tacticians have stressed the dialectical relationship between the economic development of the Western European countries, the United States, and the consequent underdevelopment of Africa. Activists and chroniclers of African and African American history have maintained that the profits accrued from the exploitation of black labor, the land and resources of Africa played a central role in the rise of world capitalism. This has been stated repeatedly for the last century by people such as W.B. Du Bois, Shirley Graham Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, C.L.R. James, Eric Williams, William Alpheus Hunton, Kwame Nkrumah, George Padmore, Walter Rodney, and many, many more. This historical materialist approach to analyzing the past as a guide to understanding the present and preparing for the future was discussed by the great Russian revolutionary V.I. Lenin. In a political biography of Karl Marx that was written in 1913, some 4 years prior to the Russian Revolution, Lenin stated, and I quote, "The discovery of the materialist conception of history, or rather the consistent continuation and extension of materialism into the domain of social phenomena, removed two chief defects of earlier historical theories. In the first place, they at best examine only the ideological motives of the historical activity of human beings, without investigating what produced these motives, without grasping the objective laws governing the development of the system of social relations, and without discerning the roots of these relations in the degree of development of material production. In the second place, the earlier theories did not cover activities of the masses of the population. Whereas historical materialism made it possible for time to study with accuracy of the natural sciences the social conditions of the life of the masses and the changes in these conditions." Unquote. Now, beginning a historical analysis from this perspective leads us into understanding that the underlying social forces that fuel the conflicts that transform society are rooted in the struggle between the dominant and subjugated classes. In the same above-mentioned work, Lenin also points out, and I quote, that in any given society, the strivings of some of its members conflict with the strivings of others. That social life is full of contradictions. That history discloses a struggle between nations and societies, as well as within nations and societies. And in addition, an alternation of periods of revolution and reaction, peace and war, stagnation and rapid progress, or decline are facts that are generally known. Marxism provides the clue which enables us to discover the laws governing this seeming labyrinth of chaos, namely the theory of class struggle. Only a study of the whole complex of strivings of all of the members of a given society or groups of societies can lead to a scientific definition of the results of the strivings. And the source of the conflicting strivings lies in the difference in the position and mode of life of the classes into which each society is divided. The history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggles, wrote Marx in the Communist Manifesto some 160 years ago, except the history of the so-called primitive communities, as Engels subsequently added some years later. Now, the class struggle is not limited to the so-called advanced capitalist countries. With the expansion of colonialism throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the Caribbean, the South Pacific, the Indian Ocean region, and within North America itself, class and national divisions were institutionalized by the imperialists to ensure the domination of finance capital. Kwame Nkrumah, the founder of Ghana's independence movement after World War II, who later became the chief strategist of the African revolutionary struggle that emerged during the 1950s and 1960s, applied the theory of class struggle advanced by Marx, Engels, and Lenin to the developments on the African continent. In reference to the imperialist domination in Africa, Nkrumah wrote in 1971, and I quote, "At the core of the problem is the class struggle. For too long, social and political commentators have talked and written as though Africa lies outside the mainstream of world historical development, a separate entity to which social, economic, and political patterns of the world do not apply. Myths such as African socialism and pragmatic socialism, implying the existence of a brand or brands of socialism applicable to Africa alone, have been propagated. And much of our history has been written in terms of socio-anthropological and historical theories as though Africa had no history prior to the colonial period. One of these distortions has been the suggestion that the class structures which exist in other parts of the world do not exist in Africa," unquote. In refuting these bourgeois and even racist notions that Africa exists outside the social processes which transform human existence, Nkrumah continued by emphatically stating that, quote, "Nothing is further from the truth. A fierce class struggle has been raging in Africa. The evidence is all around us. In essence, it is, as in the rest of the world, a struggle between the oppressors and the oppressed. The African Revolution is an integral part of the world socialist revolution. And just as the class struggle is basic to world revolutionary processes, so also is it fundamental to the struggle of the workers and peasants of Africa," unquote. The contributions of Workers' World to the understanding of the central role of Africa and other former colonial and semi-colonial nations in the global class struggle has been reviewed over the last year through various articles that have been reprinted on a weekly basis. In studying and analyzing developments that emerged during the post-World War II period, Sam Marcy and other co-founders of the party clearly recognized the political significance of the revolutions in China, in Korea, in Vietnam, in Cuba, as well as the African continent. Today, Workers' World covers the struggles against U.S. intervention in various parts of Africa, including, but not limited to, the efforts to destabilize Sudan in order to seize its oil resources, to isolate Zimbabwe over the land question, to dominate Somalia for the people's refusal to submit to a foreign imperialist-financed and coordinated occupation. The impact of the multinational oil and other extractive industries are noted in the ongoing struggles taking place in Nigeria, in Mauritania, the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Kenya, and South Africa, to name just a few. Moreover, Workers' World reports on every significant movement aimed at resisting imperialist domination in Africa and views these efforts as part and parcel of the international battle to defeat capitalist globalization and to guarantee a socialist future in Africa and around the world. As anti-imperialists, as proletarian internationalists, we will continue to work in solidarity with all genuine mass movements, as well as progressive and revolutionary organizations in Africa. The role of the Africa Command, AFRICOM, and other militarist schemes to subjugate the continent will be defeated by the organizational weight of the African workers and farmers in conjunction with a class-conscious proletariat in the Western countries. Finally, the understanding and appreciation of the role of the African continent in the global class struggle also relates to the pivotal importance of resolving the problem of racism in the United States, what Marxists call the national question. The over 40 million people of African descent in the United States have always maintained a recognition of the continent as their historical homeland. Consequently, the history and contemporary affairs of Africa are a major concern to the African American people. The most progressive and revolutionary elements in the African community in the United States have always taken great consideration of the struggle for liberation by the peoples of the continent as an important objective in their own efforts aimed at achieving total freedom in this country. Workers' World has always understood the Leninist approach, the Leninist principle of upholding the right of self-determination of oppressed nations under capitalism and imperialism. In the last year, the paper reprinted articles from the early 1960s when support and solidarity was expressed around the Congo crisis of 1960 and 1961, when Patrice Lumumba, the leader of the Congolese Revolution, was overthrown and assassinated. There was also unconditional support for the civil rights campaigns that led to the desegregation of public accommodations, voting rights, affirmative action, and the right to assembly and protest right here in the United States. At the same time, editorials have been recovered where Sam Marcy had written statements in support of the urban rebellions of 1967 in Newark and other cities around the United States. Just in the last several weeks, the role of Workers' World in the campaign of Jesse Jackson in 1984 and 1988 has been recounted. This working class voice has continued in this tradition. The party has never wavered on supporting and defending the inherent right of African Americans to determine the form and method of their struggle for liberation. Even in the recent campaign of Senator Barack Obama, Workers' World analyzed the significance of the social forces that propel the president-elect into the electoral victory, where he will become the first African-American president of the United States. At the same time, the newspaper defended President-elect Barack Obama and Michelle Obama against every racist attack by the right wing and exposed the threats posed by the character of the McCain-Palin political base. African Americans and other oppressed nations in the United States have and will continue to play an essential part in the overall class struggle against the ruling class and its surrogates. Thank you very much, comrades.